Welcome everyone to the third event of Bad September. My name is Catherine Dupelou-Menager and I'm the Artistic Director of Bad Sydney. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, to waters and to culture, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I'm speaking today from Darkinjung land near the Hawkesbury River, European name for the Hawkesbury River. I'm delighted to welcome Karin Slaughter back to Bad this year. Karin, you were with us rather last year at our last online festival in 2020, and we're really happy to be back. But I want to say next time, we'd like you to be on a stage in the flesh so we can actually see you and if not touch you, then at least wave to you more closely. It's fantastic to see you back. We've last time you talked about your new book. Then this time you're going to talk about your latest book, which I have to say I have hugely enjoyed, and that is False Witness. It's a fantastic book. Before we go any further, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the City of Sydney and Create New South Wales, without whom we really wouldn't be able to run our online events and our face-to-face festival. The climate at the moment is so uncertain, you have to change within a few days, so it is really appreciated. We also have a relationship with Booktopia, our online bookseller, and you can buy Karin's books there. We will put the link in the Q&A function, so people will be able to go directly to the page and just buy as many of Karin's books as you want. Now to our interview. We usually have a live interview, but because that would have meant either the audience or Karin getting up at 2 in the morning or some ridiculous time, we're actually recording this and but we'll be broadcasting it at our normal time. I asked people to send questions in advance thinking, nah, they won't do that. Talk about wrong. You all sent in lots of questions. And so Andy will be asking those as we go along. Andy Muir is our interviewer tonight. He's a writer himself. He's written for television and he writes crime fiction, which is really good because I think writers can interview writers very well. They know what questions to ask. Finally, welcome to all members of the Bad Sydney community, and in particular, all the people who are watching this through their public libraries. Karin, I know that you are a great advocate of public libraries, and we've set up a relationship with the public libraries, particularly outside the main cities. We were hoping that they would be streaming this event to groups in the libraries, not possible this time because everybody's in lockdown, but we've given away lots of tickets to people to watch from home. So that is really exciting. So I'll disappear now and let you get on with a fascinating conversation.
Well, thanks for that, Catherine. So yes, as we said, we're talking to Karin Slaughter today, and for those of you who don't know, Karin's being published in over 120 countries. She's got 35 million copies of her books sold. She's written over 20 of them. With some of you out there might be familiar with her Grant County and Will Trent series, or maybe some of her standalones, such as Pieces of Her, which, as Catherine mentions, Netflix has recently finished filming with Toni Collette. But on top of being a #1 bestseller, Karin's also the founder of the Save the Libraries Project, a non-profit organisation established to support libraries and library programming. So in this session, we'll be covering all of that and more, including Karin's latest book, her 21st, I believe it is, False Witness. So hello, Karin.
Hello. I'd like to just right off the bat call you guys out though, because I was in Australia many years ago when the Olympics was happening, not the ones held in Sydney in Australia. And Australians will in fact get up at 2 in the morning if an Australian is playing ping pong or swimming or anything else. So I just want that on the record.
Yeah, we're very loyal. We do kind of like to support things, and I think that I got up early the other day to actually kind of watch your Bloody Scotland interview as well. So
yeah.
it's being on the other side of the world, time is sometimes a bit of a tricky thing to navigate, but it's great that, you know, we're able to do this today and to talk about false witness, which, you know, I had sort of read some of your early work years ago, and so it was great to kind of dive back in, because it's such a page turner. It's such a ripping read that I really loved it. I mean, how would you sort of describe the story to people?
Well, I mean, I like the adjectives you use. Those are very flattering sorts of adjectives for a crime writer. You know, it's about trauma, really. And so it starts with two sisters who have something extremely horrific happen, which isn't giving away much, because usually if you're in the first chapter of one of my books, you're going to see some shit. And then we catch up with them 20 years later and we see how that trauma has played out. And of course, since this is a thriller, something from that event comes back to haunt them, as they like to say, and when they're describing books and trying to get readers to buy them. For me, though, it's mostly about trauma. It's set during the time of COVID. It's not about COVID. It just has them, you know, doing pandemic adjacent sorts of things like wearing masks and using hand sanitizer and that kind of thing, because it just seemed really appropriate. And I know, Andy, you do this in your own writing, but when you write a novel, even a fictional novel or a fictional book, you're really pulling from what you're seeing around you in the world. And I wanted to talk about the trauma that we're all enduring at the same time. I mean, you guys, me, no one on earth is untouched by this. So I just really wanted to talk about the fact that we're all enduring what is horrific and life-changing and life-altering. And we're losing people, and people are losing their health and their jobs and their identities. And what's that going to look like in 20 years? Where are we going to be once we come out of this?
It's really interesting, because this is it's definitely the first COVID novel that I've read. I'm sure it won't be the last, but I know that talking with some of my other writer friends, there's been a conversation about, oh, do we include COVID in our work? Is it going to date stuff? But it is really important, and this is something that crime writing often does, where it is more of a comment on the time. And is that something that you're conscious of doing with your work? Are you sort of trying to put it in a moment in history?
I am, you know, and I used to shy away from that because I thought, you know, I want someone to be able to pick up Blindsided, my first Grant County book, 20 years later, and it still feels relevant. But, you know, they don't even make Lincoln Town cars anymore that Jeffrey drove. And, you know, they're faxing things. And, you know, it's like there's no way to do that and have it feel realistic of the day, but you can make it of the moment. And, you know, when I was in college, very briefly, I was a dropout. If you're going to do that, write a book. But I read this, well, she didn't like to call them short stories. I'm talking about Catherine Ann Porter. She liked to call them short novels. And it's called Pale Horse, Pale Rider. It's part of an eponymous collection. And she endured the flu pandemic. And she wrote about it in a fictionalized way, but she really captured like the smell and the taste and the texture of the pandemic, that things that we've lost, like that people turned almost purple because of the lack of oxygen and the sound of people coughing. And she's this young woman, she's afraid her boyfriend's going to die. She's going to lose her job. She's going to lose her housing. I mean, this is all stuff we're seeing right now. But I read about the flu pandemic when I was in high school, and it meant very little to me until I read Pale Horse, Pale Rider. And I thought I had the opportunity to capture the insanity that we're living through and things that won't be captured in textbooks. Like in Atlanta, for instance, we have a lot of distilleries, and they couldn't sell their alcohol. So they started distilling hand sanitizer. So everywhere you went, you know, you'd put the sanitizer on and then you kind of hold your hands up and go, oh, that's rum, you know, that's gin or whiskey or whatever. And that's the kind of thing I wanted to put into the book, was just the madness of it, the sense, the craziness of all of it.
Yeah, it's kind of because I mean, when you kind of think about the great sort of the golden years of detective fiction, and that Agatha Christie, where she's kind of talking, characters use the phone, but they've got to use the operator, and we don't kind of judge books by we don't use operators anymore, but it's something that all sort of crime writing has is it is very much kind of the moment, and I
Well,
mean,
my one of my favorite stories about Patricia Highsmith when she was living in France was she couldn't get a telephone. And she even had her publisher write to, whoever was in charge of telephones in France to try to get a telephone for her. And so in all the Ripley books, you'll notice he's constantly having trouble making phone calls, constantly. And it's like, we still do that. If I'm going to get mad at Taco Bell, I'm going to put that in my book. It's just the sort of thing that gets incorporated. So I love details like that.
yeah, and that's actually something that I really love about your work is that sort of attention to detail and the observation. I mean, in A False Witness, like on page 170, there's a police interview where the victim, it actually has to take place in a kid's interview room, and this kind of victim is in this kind of surreal situation of being interviewed by the police, but it's on little kids chairs, and there's and I kind of thought that's a real thing, that's an authentic detail that you've picked up through research, and that's kind of one of the joys of being a writer, is kind of getting those real details, isn't it? Because you wouldn't, if you were kind of thinking of writing something, you wouldn't think that.
Yeah. Well, and one thing you learn, and I'm sure you do this, Andy, when you talk to police officers or you read reports or whatever, is you learn just how horribly women are treated by law enforcement, and not intentionally in many, many cases. But the fact that most women who experience a sexual assault or something like that are asked if they want to prosecute the crime. I mean, no person whose spouse was murdered ever had the cops say to him, look, we can find who did it, but it's going to be really difficult and you're going to have a trial and all that. Are you sure you want to do it? And I know some cops, and not necessarily the ones you would expect, but young cops, women who will say, I've never investigated a rape where the woman was actually raped. And you just think that is statistically impossible. And so, that's the kind of thing I want to write about, is we don't talk about it openly. We like to think in our heads that these crimes are being prosecuted. They're very rarely prosecuted. Most of the time in America, they're pled down because we do tons and tons of plea deals in these cases, because the cops convince the victims, well, that's going to be better, or you don't want to roll the dice. So it's better that he gets 3 months house arrest than he goes away, gets away with it. So those sorts of things I think are really important to talk about, and how women are treated just from a law enforcement perspective. But in that scene also, I wanted to show there are cops who know how to talk to victims of trauma and to treat them respectfully. And there's a way to train them how to do that.
Yeah. Which is kind of raises an interesting point. I found an interview that you did in 2004 where the quote was, I guess that as a Southerner, I'm really interested in character and transcendence. And unless you test a character, you really don't know what kind of person they are. And that's what you do through all of your work. I mean, it's not only, the victims that are kind of having the character tested by the experience, but it's also you're testing the police. And it's not always a black and white scenario. They're sometimes having to work in that gray area, aren't they?
Yeah. And, we all want to think that cops are doing the right thing, right? We want to think that, and we want to think everybody in prison is really guilty. And, we just don't spend a lot of time thinking about, everybody makes that classic, well, don't bend over in the shower and pick up the soap joke. Well, that really happens in prison. And do you want someone who has a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, or who wrote a bad check or did something stupid and stole somebody's car? Do you really want them to go to prison and get gang raped? Because they're going to come out, and what are they going to be like after that experience? So I do like to really explore the humanity on both sides. But I think we need to remember as citizens and as, you know, people who are police officers, that they police by our consent. And so really, we need to make them accountable for when bad things happen. And they need to make each other accountable when bad things happen, because they don't want to be perceived as lawless, because eventually they lose, we take back that consent and we don't allow them to do that job anymore. And that would be a really horrible situation.
Yeah, which, I mean, that kind of, there's a quote again in False Witness where the older sister Leigh is talking about her younger sister Callie, and she says it's not about making good choices, it's about having good choices. And when you sort of look at, you know, incarceration rates and people who are in prison, it's often that kind of lack of choice that's why they've ended up there. It's not because, you know, they necessarily they made a bad choice, but they didn't have a choice in that decision.
Right. It wasn't go to Harvard or steal a car.
Yeah.
Right. You know, it was, do you want to eat? Or, you know, I mean, just the boredom of some of these kids. A lot of them are kids when they enter the system, and they've made really stupid mistakes. And I can't speak for your justice system, but here we just continually punish them. We make it very difficult for them to find housing and jobs and support. And when you're poor in America, you are really poor. You know, you don't have water, you don't have a toilet kind of poor, and God forbid you need health care, right? So, you know, that kind of horror that you go through sometimes, if you've just made a stupid mistake, can impact you for the rest of your life. And if you have children, it spreads down to them and their families and their schools, and, you know, in policing, it's all impacted by that. And honestly, as someone who has like more of a financial leaning than most authors, because I used to run a business, I'm like, look at how much money you could save if you just made their lives a little easier.
Yeah.
You know, because it's so expensive to go through, you know, the prison system, and you lose so much potential. They could be out there working and taking care of their families. And so that I try to incorporate that in my work and make people kind of think about all sides of it. Because it's very important that we understand as a society what it means when someone is convicted of a crime, and what it means also when someone is the victim of a crime. You know, there's a case here in America where a young woman went missing, and, you know, everybody's like, of course her boyfriend did it, and her body was found. And the internet is just so all over this. And I want to say to them, hey, look, this is a real human being. This could have been your sister. This family is really hurting. It's not a game show. Because I think people sometimes lose sight of that.
Yeah, and it's so important, especially when we're writing crime, is to kind of not forget that these are real people. Exactly. Or that, you know, this is a real experience that someone might have gone through. I mean, how do you kind of stay conscious of that?
Well, it's really my primary directive as a crime writer, because I write very realistically. And I do that by choice. I've done it from the beginning by choice. And the main motivator for that is because when I was growing up, my grandmother was being horrifically abused by my grandfather. He just beat the hell out of her all the time. He was a horrible drunk. And we would go to church every Sunday, and then we would go to her house for Sunday dinner that she had cooked for us. So it's me and my sisters and my 8 uncles and their family, and she's cooked for them, right? And my uncles would tease her about being clumsy, because sometimes she would have a bruise on her lip, or her black eye, or occasionally a broken bone. And they would just say, oh, clumsy, you know, you're so clumsy. Mm-hmm. And as I got older, I thought, no one is this clumsy. It's my grandfather. And it never, ever helped my grandmother to be silent about that. It only helped my grandfather. And, you know, my uncles are these big strapping guys. They could have done something about it to stop it, but you just didn't talk about that. And so when I write my books, I think about my grandmother, and I think about all of these women who don't have a voice. And I think about the women who do have a platform, who can speak about them and do something to help them. And that's really important to me as a writer, is to create that world where you have this injustice, but people are facing it and talking about it. I don't know if that can stop it, but I know that women write to me and say, you know, thank you, this is my story. Or they like that I write about women like Leigh and Callie in False Witness, or Sarah Linton, who's a strong woman and who has opportunities and things like that, and is able to make something of her life, and also have a partner in her life who loves her and supports her, but who is not an abusive partner, or who is not trying to trap her.
Mm. I did want to, I want to come back to that, because obviously that relationship is quite important to that other series. But I also wanted to kind of just briefly touch on the violence question, and it's not a gendered question. I mean, you've raised some really great points about sort of gendered questions about violence in the past, but this is actually a writing question, because I can't write violence. I self-censor, and and I actually kind of looking at your work, I've kind of solved a problem with my own work at the moment that I'm trying to nut out. I went, oh, all my characters are too nice. They've got to get dark. They've got to get, So is there how do you kind of write those dark places? Is there do you need to kind of step away at the end of it? Is there some sort of distancing that you need to do, or?
Well, not necessarily. And I would say to you, Andy, you need to write the characters you're comfortable writing. I mean, obviously you're doing pretty well. This is what I'm passionate about. And I often say to readers, if you're squeamish or this isn't your kind of book, there's so many other fantastic writers you can read. For me, I see them as real people. And, maybe it's being from a part of America in the South with this history of Southern Gothic, but there's always a darkness that underlies a lot of stories that you grow up with as a child here. I mean, we sort of, we drink the Gothic from our mother's milk. And, I grew up hearing stories about, people who had horrific things happen to them, all kinds of farming accidents or getting shot, and people saying, well, he deserved to be killed, that sort of stuff. So that's really just, it's not very difficult for me to write about the darkness. A lot of times I am very careful to balance it out with a sense of humor. I mean, in this book, Callie probably has, of any of the characters I've written, a sense of humor that's closest to mine, because at times it's very impenetrable and you have to understand a lot about animals for any of her puns to make sense, which is something I've been haunted by since childhood. So, I don't really have a problem going to those dark places or getting out of them. What gets to me is, if I have, it's not the scene where the bad thing happens. It's not where, they're fighting or whatever. It's those small moments that are extremely emotional, when Callie and Leigh are talking the way sisters talk, only to each other. Those scenes feel to me more raw than writing the opening chapter, for instance, or that feels very choreographed. I've thought about it quite a lot. I want to pull back enough so I don't feel like I'm exploiting something, but I want to show enough so people understand the horror of what happens. So that feels very nuts and bolts when I'm doing it. But when I write a scene like we're on the swing sets, that kind of scene takes a lot out of me.
Yeah, it's a very authentic relationship, like Callie and Leigh. And I really loved Callie. I thought, I had a great affection for that character, and I love the animal stuff, and that kind of that sort of, there is a romance or a romantic view to your writing. So even though that sort of there's the darkness, there is a sort of romantic, and like Will and Sarah in your other in your series, that is a romantic relationship. It's sort of, it does balance out, doesn't it?
It does. And it's so important because, I write about really bad men, because men commit a lot of these crimes. I even had Amanda say to Faith in one of the books, don't hate all men because of the job you do, because it's a real problem for women in policing, because all they see is really horrible men all the time.
Yeah.
It's the reason why they have like 6 or 7 divorces under their belts. Well, plus they picked the wrong man, but that's another topic. And so I want to show Will as a good guy, but I also want him to make mistakes and do stupid things and, you know, be a normal human being. But he's also someone who listens to Sarah. And to me, that is the foundation of a relationship. You know, I when I was younger, I had friends who got married and, you know, they would say, yeah, my husband thinks I'm stupid. And I would think, why would you be with someone who thinks you're stupid? You know, and, you know, now they're not. They're with men who respect them. And that's really important for me to show a man being respectful to women, because a lot of the violence we see in real life is because some men just fucking hate women, you know, and they don't want to compete with them. I mean, if you look at what the Taliban has done, it's not, they're just hanging it on some kind of religious justification. They don't want to compete with women. They don't want women to be smarter than them. They don't want to have to compete for jobs. You know, they don't want women to speak. I mean, it's like incel 101, what they're doing there. And so when I write about guys who are like that, I want to make sure that I'm showing not just good men, but women who like good men.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like also, you know, the vet character, the old vet that Callie's working for, that is such a touching relationship as well. And you know, it's a perfect demonstration of what you're saying there about balancing out that, you know, the monster with, you know, moments of real humanity and affection.
Well, you know, Dr. Jerry is one of my favorite characters. I really like a dad character. I have a good relationship with my dad. And you know, he was a great dad for daughters, because we all know how to change a tire. We all know how electricity works. You know, we all know how houses are built. And we know the work really hard, so we don't have to do any of those things ourselves. So, you know, he was just, I remember, because his mother was in such a bad situation. She was the one who was being abused. And he made sure that we understood how money worked, because she was never allowed to have her own money. We had savings accounts, and all of us, we keep our money stacked very neatly the same way, you know, low bills to high bills, because that's how he told us to do it. Because he said, if you don't respect money, it will never respect you. So, you know, those kinds of things were really important things that my father taught me. And, you know, I think about those sorts of conversations we had when I write someone like Dr. Jerry.
It's probably a good point. Sort of, there's, as we kind of said, there's a number of questions that have come in from the audience, and one of them is kind of relating to this. Is, you know, how do you find your characters? Are they invented or based on bits of many people?
Oh, I think it's both, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not traveling, obviously, but I used to get a lot of characteristics of people who were going to be bad people in my books from people I saw in the airport, you know, because it's like the internet, but you can see everybody. There's no shame. They'll take their shoes off and put lotion on their feet. Or like, you know, the guy who just takes his shirt off and gets a fork and scratches his back. These are things I have seen happen. Lots of people clipping their fingernails and toenails. I was in Poland once at the gate, and there was this man and woman, and she put her head, she got on her back on the seats and put her head in his lap. And he pulled out a pair of tweezers and started plucking her eyebrows. And she had this look like a cat being groomed. And I was like, and they looked at me. I took a picture, right? And it clicked on my phone. And they look at me like I'm being rude. I'm like, oh, come on, people. You know, you're literally grooming her. So that kind of thing, I love it. I love it. I'm absolutely going to write about it, because it's just, you can't make up that kind of shit, right? You just can't, unless you're kind of a weird, I'm weird, but I'm not that weird. So you have to pull, I think, and incorporate different things. But one thing that's very I didn't know that all people didn't do this, but I can see them in my head. So when I describe them, it's what they look like in my head. So that gives me a feeling of them being real. And, especially when you're writing a crime novel where everyone's a suspect, that every single character you meet has to be a possible suspect. It can't be like a Star Trek situation where they're in a red shirt and they're going to die in 5 minutes. You have to know who they are.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and that's kind of, I mean, you mentioned earlier that false witness is sort of around the sort of pandemic, and I think that as writers, that's one thing that we're going to struggle with, is that we're all now stuck at home, so we're not actually kind of able to observe that kind of day-to-day, those little curiosities that, if you were kind of to sit down and write a scene where a boyfriend started grooming his girlfriend's eyebrows, people would go, "That, come on, that's just a step too far." But that's what we're kind of losing, isn't it?
Yeah, we are. I mean, is that good or is that bad?
I don't know.
It is. I do think that people, when they do go out, I know you guys have had a break where you are prior to this in the lockdown, and you kind of go out and you're looking around and people are in your face, and it's very disconcerting when you're back in among people. I mean, I haven't been in a crowd of people in a really long time. I'm not sure I'm prepared for that stimulation.
Mm. Yeah, I sort of was catching public transport. It's like, I don't know whether that's going to be how that's going to feel. Like it's sort of going to be too close to people for too long. But
yeah.
Anyway, another question that sort of came up just then was, do you believe people are intrinsically good or bad, or do their circumstances and upbringings push them to bad behavior?
Well, so it's nature nurture.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of science about nature. And they have to be careful in that area because it's like pretty soon you're walking the road to genocide.
Yeah, eugenics.
But I think there are certain things that you're just wired for and that you're more predisposed to do, right? Our circumstances will trigger whatever you're wired to do. Whereas if you had grown up in a mansion and you had everything, you probably wouldn't think to do any of those things, right? Because your survival doesn't depend on it. And I think it's what I said, whether or not you have good choices to make is a big factor in that. But I don't really believe in evil as a concept. I think it's kind of something we tell ourselves because it makes us feel better than to think, oh, well, this person who's in prison, his mother was an alcoholic or she was hooked on meth. And so, when he was developing in her womb, he had all this, these chemicals and things. And we don't want to really think about there's some causes, right? Or his entire family was in prison and so he didn't know anything else or that kind of stuff. So it really is fascinating. But I also think that we shouldn't dismiss that there are choices, right? I mean, you even if you have bad choices, you do choose which one. And some people are better equipped to make those decisions than others. Is it nature or nurture? Is it just like a genetic roll of the dice? I mean, that's yet to be solved. But I don't think someone who does bad things is a bad person all the time, right? I think, and someone who's a good person occasionally does really bad things. So it's very dangerous to look at it in those very black and white ways. I mean, certainly if you're a horrible person and you commit crimes, you should be punished for it, right? And you wouldn't say to the victims, well, he's a good guy. Sometimes, he takes his mother's trash out. That's not very meaningful. But evil is something I don't believe in. And it kind of goes with that. They were just born that way. Though I do love the Lady Gaga song, but I think that there's a lot more that goes on than we will ever even know in our lifetime.
Yeah. So do you think that storytelling was in your nature, or was it nurtured?
Well, I think both, because my father told stories all the time when we were growing up, and that's a very Southern tradition, very agrarian society. So you can't go into town and see a show. You're just going to talk about the time Aunt Pappy fell off her stool, and ended up breaking her elbow, or, that's the kind of, so my dad loved telling stories about everybody in our family, and only some of them were true. So I picked up from him that storytelling is a thing. Now, the fact that I started writing it down myself, I mean, that was something that no one in my family had done. And it made me very strange and stand out a little. And I loved reading, and I didn't come from a reading family by any stretch of the imagination. So I just happened to end up at the library. My dad said, she loves reading, let's take her to the library. And the librarians there were amazing, and they encouraged me to write books. I wrote a lot of books when I was 5 and 6 years old, because I just wanted to do it. And my dad would pay me $0.25 for every book I wrote. So I was incentivized to keep going because I love candy. And so how it came about, I don't know. But I do think, I've just gone out of my way to say, who knows, nature or nurture or any of that. But writing does choose you, because, and this from your own perspective, it can be really painful and frustrating and annoying. And some days you would choose to be the person who's swinging a hammer and getting a nail in and it's done, as opposed to the person who's working on this scene that's not quite working. And, so it is a job, but it's also a calling in a lot of ways.
It is. And stories infect us. I think that's something I really get in, when it's not going well and you need this story to get out and it's just not happening. And, it's those good days and bad days at the writing desk.
Absolutely.
So in terms of your writing, I mean, Pieces of Her, is that the first of your works to be adapted to the screen?
It is. Yeah. I've had options before. And, honestly, I've been really wary of that. I had offers earlier for Grant County and Will Trent, and they didn't seem to understand it, or they wanted to just put it somewhere else where it wouldn't make sense. And, they'd say, well, what if it's in South London? It's like, well, that's a very different experience. It would be like putting it in Melbourne instead of Sydney. The feel of it is just so different. And so with this, the producer came to me, and she's an amazing woman, an Australian.
Yeah.
And she had such a vision for it. And, I talked to the head writer, and she really got the stories and the characters. And then Toni Collette, it just became a whole Australian thing when she signed on. And I've loved her since Muriel's Wedding, which tells you how old I am. And it just all came together, and I read the scripts, and, they have to make changes. Pieces of Her, if anyone remembers, a lot of it is the character Andy sitting in her car driving. That's not riveting television. So they had to make some changes. I agree with the changes. It's really exciting, though. I wish I'd been able to go to Australia, only because I love Australia, but also it would be really fascinating to see how they were doing everything.
Yeah, I was going to ask, were you tempted at all to try writing any of the script, or?
Let me tell you. So on a previous project, they asked me to, and it was an original thing. I was working with a co-writer, and we were in his car driving to the writing room. And he said, we got some great notes from the script, but Trevor thought this scene was a little slow. And I said, who's Trevor? And he said, oh, well, he's an intern. He's in high school. And I was like, I'm not listening to Trevor. Are you kidding me? Fuck Trevor. And that was like my jumping feet first into the understanding that these are very collaborative. I mean, can you imagine, Andy, if people were telling you, on page 30 here, you use the word they instead of them, or, wanting to change things. And I'm not at this point in my life, I would never say never. I'm not a collaborative writer. I think, well, if I've written it, then I think it's perfect. So whatever you're telling me, if you want my opinion, you're wrong, which is the exact wrong way to have an attitude if you're going to be writing a script. Because of course, everybody gets an opinion, and there's people who are fantastic at that, at getting all that in. I will say Netflix, though, their input has been extremely helpful. You know, I heard all of these horrible things, people saying, oh, the network has these stupid notes. They really get what it is and they understand it and they have such respect for everybody. So, and I'm not just saying that because I already got paid. And so it's been a really interesting process. I can't wait to see what happens.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And I mean, you know, my background is television before I started writing crime novels. So I kind of completely get that collaborative, you know, mode. And then the novels, it's all on your own. And this is mine.
Which do you prefer? Which do you prefer? Be honest.
Well, when I'm writing a novel, it's like I wish I was writing television, and television, I wish I was writing the novel. So
yeah, sounds
but
right.
they're just so different. I love the collaboration of television. That kind of, you know, everyone's kind of lifting the material to the next level because you're kind of, you know, feeding off each other and all that, which you don't really get when you're doing your book. You can't really, you know, talk through every plot point and idea with other people.
Yeah, I just like to keep it all to myself, you know? That's the problem. I don't want anybody to know my crazy details.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing with television also, that because everyone watches so much of it, they think they can do it. I think it's just you know, conversation and dialogue and that. But, you know, even though all of us are readers, not everyone thinks they can write a book, which is kind of an interesting thing when we're going to talk about your Save the Libraries project. How did that come about? And maybe explain a little bit for the audience what it is.
Well, you do so much better by your libraries there. I mean, you're not the best. Let's be honest. You're not Denmark. But here we've really been horrible toward our libraries, especially after 2008 when the financial downturn happened. So a lot of these cities and municipalities that locally fund libraries were saying, hey, let's just get rid of the library. Too much money. You know, people don't need to read. What's up with that? And they do need to read, and not just for pleasure. And it just kind of is short-sighted not to think about children who need to have access to books. And they don't need to just have it because books are fun. I mean, we all know books are fun, but there's all sorts of science supporting the fact that if a child doesn't learn to read during a particular time in their life, they will never be fluent readers. Not only that, their brains don't develop the way a reading child's brain does. So you can look at scans of brains and they don't have those critical thinking connections that you need as an adult to make good decisions. And a lot of politicians probably think that's great because that means they're not going to be informed voters and they'll probably vote for me. But we do need children to have books. And in our libraries, for instance, we've had them in the United States. I mean, I know Australia is vast, but some of it you just don't live in because you would die. But in a lot of rural areas in America, the only access to the internet that kids have is the library. So virtual schooling meant that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of children in these rural areas couldn't be at school. And so their parents would drive them to a library, or a library would send a bus out that had a hotspot so that they could get online. But a lot of these libraries are still using dial-up. So the infrastructure isn't there. So, you know, supporting libraries is so important. They're really the backbone of not just the community, but our education system. And Save the Libraries in 2008 was started to help raise money to keep libraries open. Was our initial goal, and to, you know, make sure that books were being bought and resources were there. And we did some fundraisers. I had some authors like Lee Child and Catherine Stockett and, you know, just a ton of other people who are going to be pissed at me because I can't think of their names. Charlene Harris, you know, Tess Gerritsen, who did fundraisers to help. And then we were like, well, why don't we just give them money? And so to date, we've given about $500,000 to libraries. And it's in the United States, and there's an agency in Britain that we've supported. So that's what Save the Libraries is all about. And, you know, mostly it's because every writer I know got their start in a library, and we want to give back and do something to support them. And this seems like a good thing to do.
And you might be interested to know that this is actually going out to a number of regional libraries throughout New South Wales, who are kind of, you know, this is probably the only chance they're going to get to sort of see sort of someone like yourself, because even if you were able to come to Australia, there'd be no way that you'd be able to get out to some of the more remote regional areas of New South Wales. So they are really
I have
important.
had offers when I've been there, like some guy in a ute saying, I can take you out. Passed up on that.
That's Wolf Creek.
Yeah.
But they are really important, aren't they? I mean, you look at Barack Obama, Nicola Sturgeon, all great readers and supporters of literature. And as you say, like so many writers, it's the librarian that kind of handed them a book when they were 8 or 10 and said, here, read this. You need to sort of do something a bit, expand your brain a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of, certainly, it seems to have been your experience as well. I mean, you had a librarian introduce you to Flannery O'Connor and Gone with the Wind. I mean,
Absolutely. And she was more taking things out of my hand, like Thornbirds or Lace or V.C. Andrews. She's like, oh, don't read that. Don't read this instead. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Librarians are incredibly educated. You would think overeducated in library sciences, but they're basically running a business. So they have they have to do all those different balls that they're juggling. And then they got to find the little kid who's reading all the turned down pages of V.C. Andrews and say, no, sweetheart, maybe you should be reading something a little less sweaty than that book right there. So the job they do is amazing, considering what they get. Considering the level of education and what they get paid, they could be doctors, and they're doing this. So I think we should do everything we can to thank them for what they're doing.
Yeah, it's so true. And we're rapidly running out of time, so I need to ask some more questions from the audience. We have one. I think I already know the answer to this one, but they want to know whether there'll be another Will Trent and Sarah Linton book.
Absolutely. Not this next one, but I've got a really good idea that's sort of festering in the back of my head, and I can't wait to write it, but it wasn't ready right now. So, but 2020, what year is this? 2023, we'll get a new Will and Sarah.
Yeah. How many books are you working ahead? I'm guessing you're kind of plotting, drafting, promoting, and then...
Yes. Well, I've always thought of different stories at the same time. And usually when I finish a series book, I've got 2 or 3 other ideas percolating. Or I'll have a standalone idea that I've thought about for a while. Like with this particular novel, False Witness, I literally wrote down that first chapter with Leigh, where she's at a school musical. I wrote that on my shower notepad. It's a waterproof notepad on suction cups in my shower 3 years ago. So, that's where I keep some of my little stray ideas that come at the most important time of your life, in the shower. So it just depends on what I'm ready to write or not.
Mm-hmm. Do you prefer series over standalone?
Well, I'm sort of like you, Andy. I prefer what I'm not doing. Like if I'm writing a standalone, I'm like, wow, this is to be so much easier with Will and Sarah. They each have their complications, because a standalone, I'm building completely new characters, a completely new world. But with Will and Sarah, I can't rely on that work being done, because I have to say something new so that readers who've read all of them will be rewarded and new readers know where they are. So each one has its own easy parts and hard parts.
Yeah. Look, go back to the reader questions, not my questions. This reader says they think there's been an increase in female victims saving themselves and less reliance on hero cops in your recent work. Is that a conscious decision?
That's from the, excuse me. Woo, that was from the beginning. It's the Mary Higgins Clark pattern. I love Mary. I mean, she was a wonderful woman, wonderful writer. But if you read her books, she never, ever, ever had a situation where the hero picks her up and saves her. She always saves herself. And from Blindsided on, I wanted to show women saving themselves. And that was a response to the idea of woman as victim. And I don't want to put pressure on women. You know, everybody says, oh, she was such a fighter, she fought back. Well, that's good. Some women can't do that, you know? So I want to make sure that there's not pressure if she doesn't fight back. I mean, there's all kinds of negative stuff about that kind of situation anyway. But I like to show that in my books because I feel like it's important, because in so many other avenues, we see women as weak and helpless and they need to be saved by men.
Mm. Yeah, it's such a trope. You've got to work hard to kind of fight against those things, don't you? It's sort of.
Yeah. Well, and women are badasses. I mean, do you know where babies come out? I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. My dad had like a stomach ache and he was in bed. I'm like, are you kidding me? Get up. So it's like, you know, but I do like to show that side of women, because women put up with a lot of shit no one ever hears about.
Mm. So yeah, another question is, what other careers would you like to have pursued or have plans to pursue in the future? I suppose we could ask, are you going to go back to sign writing?
No, you know, like if I had the idea of myself as a much more focused student, because I was a really bad student, I would have loved to have studied the law. But there's no way I would have done that volume of work, because it's just, I know myself. I know how lazy I am about stuff. Like, I'd only read the really interesting parts, you know, not the boring parts. But, you know, realistically, I would love to be a watchmaker. I think I'd be very good at that. I like how the gears go together. I'm very good at paying attention to detail. I better like take it before my window of opportunity closes, and I need like special glasses to do it. But I'd love to do something like that if I wasn't a writer.
Well, I suppose it's almost a visual representation of trying to put a plot together.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
One other little quick question is, did private schools really increase their enrollment due to COVID, as you portray with Maddie in False Witness?
Yeah. Well, in my area, yes, absolutely, they did. Yeah. A lot of people who are on the fence about doing that kind of thing definitely bought their children access, which is a real situation. You know, it's very unfortunate for the children whose parents don't have those resources, but I worry about the kids whose parents do, because it's going to make them start on first base, and they might not necessarily realize that.
Yeah.
You know. And so I would just hope that they would be aware of how fortunate they are. And it's not that they're smarter, or, you know, they're better workers, or they're better. It's just that you had that opportunity. And that's massive, especially where education's concerned.
Mm. Well, I think we've probably run out of time, unfortunately. I mean, I could have just kept on talking for ages, Karin. It's been fantastic. And I mean, my biggest question, I suppose, is, you know, is Gillian Flynn still stalking you? Because I kind of noticed that with each of your covers, like The Silent Wife, it says someone is watching you, and then Gillian Flynn answers it and says up here, I'd follow her anywhere. And then it's the same with each of your books. It's kind of like she's responding to the tag. So,
well, you know, when I was in Australia, I got a postcard with a dingo on it, and I mailed it to Gillian and said, good luck, because she was pregnant. And so she's paying me back, I think. And, you know, fair enough. Just don't hurt the face. That's what I say.
All right. Well, it has been fantastic talking to you, Karin, and I hope that our audience out there goes out there and buys all of your books and dives in like I have, because it's just such a fantastic world that you've created, both the standalones and the series. They're amazing characters. They've got fantastic twists and turns that you want in crime. And as I said, you've actually kind of helped my own writing as well. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I want to say a little to the budding forensic psychiatrist who emailed me. Good for you. Keep going. Good work. If she's watching this in Australia, she's probably studying because she's in school, but got to say that.
That was fantastic conversation. I mean, I think when I go out in public again, I'm going to be so nervous that I do anything like pick my nose. And in an airport, I think I'll just wear dark glasses and hide in a corner. Those were just really, really good stories. I think what I enjoyed about the conversation partly was it was like the back of the books, that the behind the story, what makes them, what drives you, what your ideas are. And really, hugely inspiring. And I always say that I think crime fiction is the most socially realist fiction that is ever written, because it's all about what's happening at a particular time in a particular place and what makes those people do what they do. And as Andy said, the details are always really, really revealing. And I think you handle the COVID thing brilliantly. Because it was just part of what was happening. It wasn't, this is a story about COVID. This is a story and it's raining, but the rain is COVID. And thank you for introducing me to the Pale Horse, Pale Rider. I read it and it was gripping and so physical. I recommend anybody to look at it. It gives you a physical sense of what it's like to be ill, but also the fear.
Yeah, absolutely.
That many people are going through. Well, look, thank you so much. That was just brilliant. On all counts. I'll invite people to join us next week for our last episode in Bad September, which is with Anne Cleves. So you were the third, Karen, and Anne is finishing off the month. So really looking forward to seeing you in Australia one day soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.